Very ugly morning across many cities in the United States. Tear gas, looting, setting fires to business. So far, 29 people arrested in Ferguson, Missouri, after riots broke out after that grand jury decision of Officer Darren Wilson, who will not be charged in the shooting death of black teen Michael Brown. U.S. President Barack Obama held a late-night press conference, an unusual move, asking for calm and progress on race relations. He says it will not come as a result of violence and lawlessness.
I also appeal to the law enforcement officials in Ferguson and the region to show care and restraint in managing peaceful protests that may occur. Understand, our police officers put their lives on the line for us every single day. They've got a tough job to do to maintain public safety and hold accountable those who break the law.
Sadly, his words fell on deaf ears. Let's bring Ed Prucci and Ross McLean to talk about two different things. I'll get to you on the policing, but I want to talk to you about what we heard last night, which was a very detailed account of this procedure, which took 3 months.
Right.
And I mean, the overwhelming message to me was that the media got this thing so wrong and put out so much misinformation that, you know, this officer was essentially convicted before having any kind of true.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that there was misinformation. There was partial information, and that's always part of the problem in a media scenario. The media reports, you know, we're guilty of it like anybody else, and it certainly was a story, and so everybody goes out there to get the story. Some witnesses came forward, wanted to talk to the media, tell their side of the story, and as we heard from the prosecutor McCullough, some of those people stuck with the stories they told to the media. Other people modified or changed the stories they told to the media. And yet others who did testify at the grand jury did not want to speak to the media at all. And all of that evidence was given to the grand jury, not just the evidence that was presented in front of them, but they were actually given copies of the various interviews to the media as well, so that they can make a determination on their own about whether these stories were remaining consistent. Were they consistent with the forensic evidence? Were they consistent with the autopsies? And ultimately, that's where the decision comes from. I mean, the one message that I want to send out is that it's very difficult for us to armchair quarterback, whether in the media or whether in the public or whether you're a member of the protesters or the rioters, whatever you want to call them, when you have people who sat for 94 days, heard from 60 witnesses, reviewed 3 autopsies, and their determination was this is not a scenario in which an indictment can stand.
I don't think on either. It didn't matter what the decision was last night. There was not going to be a lot of. We were looking at trouble. I mean, Brown's DNA was found on the gun of this officer. I'm not suggesting this young man deserved to be shot, but the bottom line is the evidence is that he was defending himself, if I'm to take this prosecutor at his word.
Well, I mean, it's certainly one of the suggestions that comes out of it, and it's ultimately the decision that the majority of the grand jury must have reached. Otherwise, we would have had a very different verdict. So they relied substantially on the forensics. I mean, the interesting thing that we see in terms of the grand jury dynamic is that in the normal course, there's the old saying in the U.S. that says a prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich if they wanted to in a grand jury, because they've got such a huge advantage. There's no judge, there's no defense lawyer, and they get to handpick what evidence they present to the grand jury. They don't have to present all of the evidence. This prosecutor took the unusual, and some would say inappropriate, step of dumping all of the evidence on the grand jury and saying, here's everything, you guys make your decision, and not really pushing things one way or the other. Now, I think in the normal course, that's what should happen. I think if we're going to be concerned in any scenario here, it's why did that only happen in a scenario where this cop was charged with this killing? Because the reality, and I know Ross will bring this in later on, the reality is that in most circumstances, the prosecutors use the advantages that they have in the grand jury system, and they use them to great effect to make sure they get their indictments. They didn't do that here.
Yeah, what an interesting night. Nonetheless, there was going to be a protest, Ross, no matter what happened last night. A lot of these, and I want to call them protesters, because this was a riot. There were, I mean, protesters go out and they march for what they believe. They are peaceful. There were a lot of people at this place that shouldn't have been there and were there to cause trouble either which way.
Yeah, absolutely there was. But I'm going to say something that I fundamentally disagree with Ed on this about the way this process went. And that regardless of how this process would have taken place, there would have been a riot. Yes, there would have been. But this process that went through, I just find really shielded the truth and didn't really deal with the issues correctly. What we had was a prosecutor, which I was stunned by this, Ed. He basically started the first 5 minutes indicting social media, indicting his own witnesses, indicting the press for covering it, yet he made no mention at all of what the police did on how they handled the shooting. There was no mention about the police leaks that were put out. There was no mention about the misinformation that was put out by the police department that was put out there. None of that. Instead, he chose to present evidence. That was a defense attorney's summation, not a prosecutor's summation.
Look, what we're listening to isn't a summation at all. What you're referring to is McCullough, the prosecutor's breakdown when he knows what the verdict is and he's giving his sort of explanation for 45 minutes, which I think was very appropriate. What he's trying to do, and he took the extraordinary step of releasing all of the grand jury evidence. That's not normally the case.
I don't think they had a choice in this matter.
No, they didn't, because if they hadn't done that, I mean, the questions would have lasted forever.
But we're not getting all of the grand jury evidence. We're getting all of the documents. What we're not getting is the frame of how this prosecutor presented the evidence. We're not getting the frame of what his questions were, what he told this jury, what they should consider, and how he did this. So my problem here is, and you're very right, only 1 in 11,000 grand juries gets turned down. 1 in 11,000. And this isn't about the guilt or innocence of the officer. It has nothing to do with that. It has to be, is there enough evidence here for a charge?
But how could we be critiquing a prosecutor for presenting all of the evidence and not just the evidence that favors them? Because that's what I'm hearing on media all the time now. Surely the role of the prosecutor, as opposed to a defense lawyer, the prosecutor has this public role, is supposed to be, here's all the evidence, here's where I think it goes, you guys are the jury, make your call. And yet I hear all this criticism saying, well, he could have held back evidence, he could have indicted the police in that scenario, and he could have gotten his verdict. It's not about getting the verdict that you want, it's about getting the verdict that makes sense, about getting the verdict that is truthful.
Well, let me ask you this then, Ed. Why is it when you go into court, and I know you're a very good defense lawyer, you don't sit there and let the prosecutor say, by the way, here's what we're going to prove and this is what we're going to do, and you sit down your hands and say, well, there it is, there's the full case from the prosecutor.
My expectation is that the prosecutor isn't going to hold back evidence, and if they do, I will absolutely hold them to account. My expectation is that the prosecutor will present everything, whether it helps them or hurts them. My job is much more refined and much more defined.
But
I represent
that's
only
not
one
the
person.
prosecutor's job here.
And interestingly, unlike most cases in the United States, it is my understanding that in Missouri, we cannot hear from those on the jury in this case.
Correct.
They can't talk about it. It's
we
a crime.
won't get
That's
that
right.
walkout of how they came to their determination on any of this evidence. What strikes me is though, and one thing I think the police did wrong here, and the prosecution, you know, they said they would give notice that this decision was coming out. We knew it was coming down Monday, 9 o'clock. Why would they do this at Monday at 9 o'clock, nighttime? Why didn't they do this in the morning when more people would have been at work, it would have been a much better time, I think, if you wanted to stay away from that nighttime antics. You would have had more people at work, more people at school, and less time for people to congregate in one place. I feel like they set up their officers to essentially be sitting ducks.
Well, they did, and this goes back to some of the process that I was talking about. As many people have said, why did they do this as a prime time event?
Yeah, pretty much.
In the middle of the night to do this when they know that this is going to be happening.
How do you police that? How do you police that? Because already there's so much anger towards the police, regardless of whether or not this officer was right or wrong. It was such a highly charged atmosphere, thanks to guys like Al Sharpton, who really stirred up the racial division, that I don't think that, I'm surprised it wasn't even worse. Well, and it's pretty bad.
As I said, the problem here is, and this is where I'm saying the process did a disservice. I'm not saying the officer was guilty of anything. What I'm saying, though, is this process conducted in secret. And once again, we don't know what the prosecutor said. We never know what the prosecutor questions he asked. We'll never know how he framed the information that went forward. What happens is you have people then going out and rioting because they don't feel that they're getting a sense of justice. Justice, I don't believe, has been
I don't think a lot of people
perceived to be done.
understand. I mean, look,
No, well, people
it's
didn't
hard
bother
if you
to sit through the
they didn't.
94
They weren't
days.
listening.
They couldn't do that.
Well, they couldn't sit through it, though,
The
Ed.
people, though, outside listening to the findings, they weren't listening to the findings. They were just waiting to hear. And so they probably, it won't be till today when they can actually read through it, we'll get an understanding. They were there because they wanted to hear yes or no, and then they were going to do what they were going to do. Bottom line is a community is now destroyed. These people essentially attacked their own community. And burn down businesses, etc. So they're really only hurting themselves. I think what is clear is that there is an issue, especially in the United States. And I'll ask you this, Roz, what do they do moving forward? How do they police these communities? You know, here in Toronto, we have a really diverse policing unit, and it reflects the community. So I don't know if this could happen here. We do have issues with
We're
guarding.
having a protest here tonight at 6 o'clock at the U.S. consulate
and it
for
will
this.
probably be peaceful. But what do they do in communities like Ferguson?
Well, this is where they're going to have a problem, and it's not just Ferguson. There was a network of 30 cities that were together to launch protests about this. We saw them in New York City, we saw them in Oakland, all cities that have their own issues, where a black man was just shot by an officer the other day he pulled his gun and...
But you also have a lot of black-on-black crime that doesn't spark the same outrage. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of blacks killing blacks. And where's Al Sharpton's outrage? I mean, look, you don't get the same outrage. And I'm not saying that
we can debate that going back and forth. There has been lots of people. All I'm saying is how the media covers it. There's been lots of black leaders that have gone to Chicago to complain about the violence in Chicago and work to done something.
Doesn't evoke this kind of emotion.
The truth is, well, it doesn't. It doesn't. And that's part of the problem here.
Yeah.
That's part of the problem here. And as one person said the other night, the police put more emphasis. This is what people feel. Whether you like this or not, they feel this way. They put more emphasis on protecting police stations and fire stations than they did in protecting young black lives. That's how many people feel, and they feel that this process shortchanged them.
Last point to you.
I mean, the only thing I can suggest, and you sort of touched upon it, it's not the panacea or the answer to everything, but it's about making sure that police forces are representative and respective of the communities that they police.
Sure.
It's not about bringing people in from hundreds of miles or kilometers away and having a police force that doesn't look like its community. But that's up to the community to a large extent, too. You know, Jerry Agar made this point earlier this morning. He'll probably repeat it on his show later today. There were elections in between the date of the incident and the date of this grand jury indictment. And during those elections, another white city council was put in place, even though Ferguson is 80% black. Where are those 80% of the people coming out to vote and saying, I want to run for election, I want to be part of the process, I want to appoint and hire our police officers? The community needs to take responsibility for that, and then it will have a community that represents the people who live there.
All right, good discussion, guys. Thanks a lot. Ed?